They fired me for taking a day off, not with a formal letter, not with a severance packet, but with a small rectangle of paper on a long table that said, in careful calligraphy, Olivia Hamilton. Guest. It was the kind of thing people write when they want to be polite and still exclude you. It was the kind of thing that feels like a legal document when your name is suddenly missing from where you expected it to be. My name is Olivia. I teach 3rd grade. I keep a jar of mismatched crayons on my desk and a shoebox full of thank you notes tied with blue ribbon in the closet. My students make me crowns out of construction paper for my birthday, even though I tell them every year that I don't need a crown. I need clean socks and coffee that's still warm. I have a classroom where the rug looks like someone pressed a rainbow into it, and where the bulletin board by the windows is always half covered in student drawings. Lions with 3 legs, planets with heart-shaped moons, writing assignments that begin, if I were principal for a day, I would, and end with things like, give everyone extra recess, or put hot chocolate in the fountain. Those papers are evidence to me that my work matters. I have been a teacher long enough to know the rhythm of unexpected generosity. The parent who brings muffins on a rainy morning, the PTA member who hangs a new chart of sight words on the wall, a retired neighbor who sends in a stack of gently used books. I also know the rhythm of being undervalued, the invisible weight of after-school emails, the slow erosion of supplies from my own pocket, the way people say, just a teacher, like it's an explanation and a dismissal all at once. There is a small, quiet anger in me about that. I keep it in check. Mostly I let it become steady work and stubborn tenderness toward kids who will not be able to find their way without someone persistent. My father, Robert Hamilton, is retiring after 37 years as principal at the district's flagship elementary. To him, status matters, invitations that list full titles, plaques that are heavy enough to make people stand straighter when they lift them. He is a man used to being asked, not asked to ask. For most of my adult life, I wanted his approval in the way that children want permission to go on the swings, a simple yes that feels like safety. I wanted him to be proud of the fact that I chose work that made small, stubborn differences every day. He promised me, in private and in front of people, that when the Hamilton Educational Fund reconstituted the board, there would be a seat reserved for someone who actually taught. He said my name into rooms that mattered. He said it with shoulders squared and a voice that made other people listen. Promises like that can hang in a person like a banner. He promised me a seat. The family arranged a retirement gala in a ballroom with so much crystal the chandeliers looked like they'd been harvested from stars. The invite was black tie, the programs printed in glossy white with gold print. Patricia, my stepmother, wore a dress that seemed to be made of light refracted into silk. Jessica, my stepsister, arrived like someone who had been taught to walk into rooms as if she already owned the place. We were told weeks in advance that a table would be set for us at the head, that the fund would announce new board appointments, and that they were dedicating a portion of the fund to teacher support. A line item we discussed late at night over wine and his breath between us. It was the kind of public moment that can either heal or expose the things you've quietly carried. I wanted it to heal. I wanted my father to show up as the man who had said my name in private, and then say it again in public. I wanted a firm, visible yes that would make the hard work of my day feel seen. We arrived late because that is what life with 3 after-school clubs and a kid with a stomachache looks like. Marcus, my husband, held my hand in the cab the way he holds it in the grocery store when we're choosing tomatoes. Steady, quiet, as if to say, we will pick the ripest one. He is not a man who needs to announce himself. He smiles like someone who knows a joke only he remembers, and he holds a phone that lights up with other people's problems and solutions every day. In the years we've been together, I have watched him build businesses with the same gentleness he uses arranging books on the shelf at home. He never brags. He doesn't need to. He is the kind of person who will steady a ladder for you and then refuse to climb until you've tested the next rung. In the lobby, the air smelled like roses and polish. The orchestra sounded like something from an old film, the musicians embedded under a soft golden wash. We slipped into the ballroom and scanned for our table. The head table was a long rectangle covered in white linen, orchids fat as small moons sitting in glass and place cards that shimmered in the light. My hands went cold when I saw mine. Olivia Hamilton, guest. There was a moment when my brain tried to reorder the signs into something gentler. Maybe it was a misprint. Maybe someone had moved the cards. I looked up at my father, who was being shown to his place at the podium by the chairman. He was smiling in a way that made his eyes small and precise, like a man who preferred the warmth of control. The room felt too loud. A woman leaned over to whisper something to my father. Patricia, bringing a fan of gossip like a breeze. I felt a bubble of air rise up inside me that tasted like the rawest thing, the heat that precedes something about to break. Before the program began, one of the fund's directors, David Chen, took to the podium to make the announcements. He spoke carefully about gratitude and legacy. He spoke of new initiatives and of stepping into the future. When he read the name of the person appointed to the board seat, reserved for an active classroom teacher, his voice was steady and ceremonial. Jessica Morrison. The world tilted. The orchestra kept playing a lightened tune, but somewhere in the back of the room, the sound became muffled, as if I were underwater. It was an ordinary, incredible humiliation, a replacement that had been set down like the lids on small boxes. The seat that had been promised was given to someone who had never worked a recess duty, who had never stayed late helping a child decode the words on a page. Jessica stood and smiled like a person who had accepted an honor because it had been handed to her. She walked to the podium with the same practiced ease that had told us all along she would walk into rooms and not notice what she left behind. Patricia's fingers touched my father's arm like a small domestic coronation. My father clapped like he was proud. Eventually, I clapped too, because at that moment I could assume nothing about what was true, and everything about being composed. They treated me as if I had been fired. Not officially, not with a paper or a signature, but with a social verdict, made invisible, replaced, declared irrelevant before an audience. The humiliation of being made to feel small in front of people you love is heavy in a way that sticks to the bones. It was not the first time I had been dismissed in my life. Teachers are accustomed to silences and slights and the soft way people talk about us. But to be dismissed by your own family, in a room full of colleagues and donors and neighbors, has its own particular cruelty. It's like being told your whole life was a draft. I went to the bathroom because you go to the bathroom when the world tilts. I stood at the sink and watched the light on the tile, counted the clock on the wall, and pressed my palms flat to the porcelain as if it could teach me how to breathe again. I thought of the kids whose faces would flood through my mind at any given moment. Theo with his proud crooked tooth, Maya who liked to sing her answers, Jamal who needed trust like water. For a moment I let myself be the teacher and not the daughter. The anger shrank down into something less like heat and more like a sharpened tool. When I came back into the ballroom, my father was at the podium giving a short, measured speech. He spoke about legacy as if it were a thing you could arrange like flowers. Patricia smiled beside him like an arrangement was complete. People around the room were raising their glasses. I felt the room closing in like a fishbowl, bright and unforgiving. I walked across the carpet and stopped in front of the podium. My voice folded around the words like a cloth. "Dad," I said, "can we talk about that seat?" He turned with the ease of someone who expects his life to be uninterrupted. His expression softened, the public smile sliding into a private smile, and I thought at that moment perhaps he would remember everything he had said in the small hours of his office, the lines he'd drawn for me in conversations where only we were the audience. "We'll talk later," he said, and it was the sentence that made any small vow between us fall like an unpaid bill. Later, when you are no longer visible, when you are not in the frame. Later. That small word is a slow-acting eraser. I shouldn't have asked him again. I should have known the pattern. But the room was full of people, and I wanted the cameras of their attention to capture his correction. "They promised me a seat," I said, quieter this time, because the way he had spoken made me suddenly small. "They promised me the seat." "Olivia," he said, his voice even and cool, "we've made other arrangements. Jessica will be a strong asset to the board." There is a kind of sharp, intimate grief that comes when a parent chooses to erase you. It's the folded letter you discover months later, the unspoken will. I felt my throat tighten, and the world narrowed to the distance between us. Jessica looked at me as if I were a minor inconvenience. Patricia's smile widened, a measured thing. The air smelled faintly of perfume and lemon oil and privilege. I left the table and sat with people I had known for years, but who did not seem to know how heavy the moment had been for me. I ate cold chicken. I laughed at a joke I didn't understand. I held it in because holding it in was what we did when we were chosen not to be chosen. After the program, there is always the part where the light softens and people linger. In a different life, I would have waited until later to ask for clarity. In a different life, I would have believed in the slow work of being seen. But there is a certain timeliness to being publicly shamed. It requires an immediate response, not a delayed negotiation. I walked back to my table and found Marcus waiting with an expression I could not quite read. He had been quiet the whole night, the way he is when he is thinking. I walked over and sat in the only chair that would accommodate me without asking permission. "Did he say why?" I asked. Marcus's hand came down on mine with a pressure that was steady. "Not in so many words," he said. But there were texts. He always had a way of making corporate language sound human. I felt, for the first time that evening, the weight of the world hinge. "Texts from whom?" I asked. He hesitated, and the pause did something to the edges of me. "From some of the fund's sponsors," he said finally. "From people who help keep that fund afloat. They've been hearing about restructuring. They've been—" He stopped and rubbed the back of his neck. Marcus never hid anything that mattered from me. He also never announced himself. "You knew?" I said. "No," he said. "Not exactly. But there were confident people at the table whose confidence I recognized. It's not personal to me, Liv." He used the shorthand he uses when he wants to make pain tolerable. My father moved through the room like a king with small obsessions. He greeted people and made jokes that landed like coins on a table. He shook hands in a way that suggested he had already banked whatever he needed from the evening. I watched his eyes and saw, in the corners, the careful arrangement of things he wanted to leave as his legacy. I watched Patricia and Jessica swap a glance, a small, triumphant communication I could not decode but could feel the shape of. I was quiet for the rest of the night. I said goodbyes and let people look at me like I was a branch with missing leaves. The press pictures would later show me standing there with my smile fixed, while a stepdaughter took the role that had been reserved, at least in my memory, for someone like me. That memory is a fragile thing. It hangs in the throat, needing to be reintroduced to air. That night we went home and the house felt too big, like an after-image. Marcus made coffee without asking and set it on the counter. He moved in routines like someone who preserves calm by creating habits. We sat at the kitchen table and the television murmured about the gala in the background like a distant sea. "Did it feel like they were trying to erase you?" I asked, because there are certain facts that need to be named to lose their power. Naming is like opening a window. He looked at me for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. "They treated you as if you were no longer relevant." That phrasing, "treated as if," was how I would come to call the night. A firing in social terms, not corporate. There was no HR document, no formal termination. There was a removal of dignity in plain sight. There was a substitution. It felt like being fired from the narrative of your own life. I slept badly. In the morning, the details returned in a shuffle of images. The glint of the orchids, the look on Jessica's face when she was handed the applause, the way my father's smile had creased into something like a judge's. When I woke, the house felt like a stage set. The clocks ticked like an audience rehearsing. There are people who would tell you to let it go, that family matters are small and complicated and not worth the noise of public argument. There are people who would counsel forgiveness as a cure. I had read those books too. I knew the arguments and had practiced them like a script. But we are not just individuals. We are teachers and citizens and members of economies that decide who gets funding and who gets a voice. When somebody in your life has a legacy fund and chooses, in a very public and instrumentally influential way, individuals who will sit on a board, that choice ripples. It affects grants. It affects priorities. It affects whether a district will pilot a program or not. It affects whether the teacher who organizes a literacy night gets a grant to buy books. Suddenly, a small omission at a gala can be a household's difference back home. I went into the classroom that Thursday with the hiss of the wardrobe in my bones. The kids came in with backpacks that smelled like crayons and peanut butter. They lined up and gave me slanting smiles. They leaned into me the way children do when they have been carrying a secret and are ready to unload it. I made attendance and read the first writing prompt. If kindness were a color, what would it be? A dozen marigold suns, a purple hug, a blue river of compassion. They gave me those answers like sunlight. My work dulled the edges of the night like a balm. For a while, I stopped thinking about the table in the ballroom altogether and concentrated on Jamal's punctuation. That weekend, while I was compiling lesson plans and trying to be ordinary, a link landed in my inbox. Someone had posted video clips of the gala to a local feed. In the video, you could see the head table and the moment David Chen read the name. The comments were a strange chorus. Some people congratulated Jessica. Others were outraged that a teacher had not been chosen. There was a thread of people who were noticing something else. A surprising number of parents and teachers who saw the action as emblematic of a larger problem. Who sits at tables where decisions are made about schools? Different isn't less than, one commenter wrote. I read it 2 or 3 times and highlighted those words in the draft of a letter I began to draft to my father, until I deleted the letter and kept the sentence for myself. It felt truer than any pronouncement I could have made in the heat of the ballroom. I called some friends, teachers from other districts, a few principals who'd seen more than their fair share of high-stakes dinners. They told me, with a kind of weary tenderness, that sometimes the slights are accidental and sometimes they are deliberate. It didn't change the sting. But their voices helped me straighten my shoulders. They reminded me that being a teacher is not lesser, and that a lot of the things that feel like personal betrayals are actually symptoms of systems that have always been tilted. When I told my mother about the gala, she was quiet for a long time. "People will see it," she said finally. "Just keep doing what you do." Her consolation was small and necessary, and in some paradoxical way, infuriating. Just keep doing what you do. It sounds almost like an instruction to sink. But my students needed me to be relentless in my ordinariness. They would not forgive me for collapsing under humiliations that were not theirs. At the same time, a small part of me wanted to do something visible. There is a practical calculus that teachers learn when they see a problem. Assess needs, gather allies, create interventions. I could write op-eds. I could make phone calls. I could speak at the PTA meeting. Those felt insufficient. The hurt required not just an apology, but structural correction, something that addressed the real stakes of who controls funding and why people who actually teach should have a voice where it matters. There is an ironic thing about being underestimated. It places you under a pressure that eventually reshapes into leverage. I did not know yet that leverage would arrive in the form of a quiet text, and a man who had been sitting quietly at my table, smoking the same anxiety as the rest of the room but handling it differently. Marcus was not a man who liked the spotlight. He preferred to work behind the scenes, to make platforms for other people. He had built companies that made tools for schools, software that helped track reading progress and parent engagement. Over the years, he donated to a few programs under his company's name, always quietly, always as if it was a personal habit rather than a public display. He had an account of goodwill the size of a small city, not in money alone but in relationships and trust. He had partners and investors and a reputation for making things that actually helped teachers do their work. That Monday morning, he came into the kitchen with a different expression. He folded his hands and set his phone on the counter between us like he was placing a small relic. "I read some of the threads," he said. "More people than I expected are upset. There are teachers in the comments who say this affects whether their programs will exist." He reached for the coffee and stirred it with a spoon. "Okay," I said, not knowing what I wanted him to do. Part of me wanted him to be furious in the way that made people look scared. Part of me wanted him to be quiet and legal and careful. Part of me wanted him to say, plainly, "I will fix this." He looked at me and said, "I don't like when people who actually do the work are sidelined. I don't like it at all." He said it as a fact, not an argument. That night he stayed up late at his laptop. I did not pry. He had his own way of working through things. He would gather the facts, map the relationships, and then make a move that, for people who didn't see the scaffolding, appeared spontaneous. I had seen it before. A quiet pivot at a board meeting that became a program for literacy, a sponsorship that turned into a field trip fund. He had also, in the hush of our marriage, told me about clauses and donors and the way sometimes a single line in a grant agreement can direct the entire future of a program. On Wednesday morning, he showed me something he said he'd been hesitant to show because he didn't want to escalate things. It was an email chain and a small screenshot of a clause in a sponsorship letter. The language was plain, but it had teeth. A preference for active classroom educators in governance decisions tied to certain funds. Section 7.3, it read. The clause struck through any notion of substituting token representation for actual classroom experience. I read the clause and did what teachers always do first. I translated it into its consequences. If the fund had accepted money that was explicitly tied to teacher representation in decision-making, and then handed the seat to someone without that experience, it was not only an insult. It was a bending of the terms under which donors had given. That wording is not necessarily a full stop in the legal sense. It is, though, a hinge. Marcus looked at me. "I'm not saying I want to make a spectacle," he said. "But if the fund is going to ignore the terms under which money was given, then we can't pretend that nothing happened." He always had a way of making the technical feel like an ethical choice. "You can't make them give the seat back," I said, mostly to test the limits of the idea. "This is family. This is a public event. People will dig in." "No," he said. "We can't force them, but we can change whose priorities are funded. We can put money where teachers already are." His words fell into place like a map I had not noticed. Redirect the funding, create a new vehicle for teacher support, put the muscles of funding behind educators who actually work in classrooms. It was a strategy. It was also, beneath everything, a stake in dignity. If you cannot command recognition at your father's table, create a table that the community owns. I have always been wary of gestures that only look like change. There are foundations that exist to launder reputations. There are programs that take grant money and give it to consultants while teachers watch. Marcus knew that. His plan, as he unfolded it, had a forensic quality to it. He wanted to trace every dollar, to create an independent fund with governance rooted in the classroom, to make sure the resources reach teachers and not just PR lines. It would not be a slam dunk overnight. Money doesn't move like a light switch. There are board meetings and bylaws and the slow, patient work of convincing people to change their habits. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. He smiled in that small, steady way that means the plan is serious and also tender. "Help me name it," he said. "Help me build it. Help me make sure the people who get to decide on the other side of those grant applications are people who read the same classroom notes you keep." There was a moment, the kind of small, dangerous moment that can be a turning point, where being deeply hurt and being given an immediate tool to push back overlapped. I could have said no. I could have insisted we move more slowly, that we not make the family drama into a platform. I could have insisted that my dignity was not something to be traded for spectacle. Instead, I felt the tug of responsibility. If you teach, you learn to translate anger into action. The city that funds your programs is the city you owe your labor to. That week, Marcus began to call in favors. He reached out to partners and whispered to colleagues. He sent a careful note to the fund's sponsors, not public. He asked questions that were blunt and exact about the language in the sponsorship agreements and about the fund's fiduciary obligations. Sometimes change starts as curiosity. The right question asked at the right time can make people in rooms where decisions are habitual start to sweat. "You should be careful," my sister-in-law warned over the phone. "This is family business. Don't make enemies." I thought of the kids who needed books and of Jamal's parents who could not take time off work to fight paperwork. The decision to act became less about revenge and more about stewardship. If resources were being misdirected because of privilege or habit, then someone needed to turn the current toward classrooms. So we began. We began in the small way people who know how to do big things do. Quietly, meticulously, and with a stubborn ethics. We assembled a team of lawyers and nonprofit consultants who had worked with schools and with donors, who refused to be mere patrons and wanted outcomes. We drafted charters and governance documents. We offered a concept, a foundation that would channel funds into teacher-led grants, scholarships for educators seeking higher certification, and emergency aid for teachers facing crises. The name Marcus proposed made me laugh and then cry. The Olivia Hamilton Foundation. He said it in a voice that made the room at our kitchen table small and luminous. "I'm not doing this to embarrass your family," he said. "I'm doing this because teachers need a voice." It felt like a dangerous gesture to name it after me. It felt like a promise I wasn't sure I wanted on my shoulders. But the name also felt like claiming the right to be present at a table without needing permission. We knew that any move would cause blowback. There are always costs to changing where money flows. Some people would call it performative. Others would take it as a personal affront. That we had accepted. But we were not looking for a fight. We were looking for leverage. What we did not anticipate was the way the hall would turn on a hinge in a single night. How a small clause and a place card could rearrange the geometry of power in rooms none of us realized were so fragile. The narrative here can branch toward courtroom battles or quiet resolutions. It can turn into scandal pieces or into community lifelines. I can hear the questions now. Did Marcus buy the building? Did he force them to hand over the keys? The truth is stranger and simpler. People who are underestimated sometimes build new rooms. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do when you've been made invisible is create a space where invisibility is not allowed. That is how the first part of our plan took shape. Naming, structuring, fundraising, and preparing to introduce a new venue for the priorities that actually feed classrooms. It was not, in the formal sense, buying an entire building. It was buying back control over how resources are allocated. It was a literal redirecting of money, yes, but also a symbolic claiming of a space where teachers' voices would be central and not ceremonial. And while we did the preparatory work, the family had no idea what had been set into motion. They continued their routines, parties, speeches, the slow choreography of status. I continued my ordinary, stubborn work. The difference was now that we had a plan. A few days after the gala, at a small dinner with a teacher friend who had seen the entire mess unfold, I said, more to myself than to anyone, they fired me for taking a day off. It was true in a way that needed no legal paper. I hadn't been able to make the first-grade field trip one spring because my sister-in-law had an emergency and I'd had to be the one to hold a child's hand through a hospital corridor. That absence was used, it turned out, as a wedge in conversations about who was active enough to be on a board. It was a cruel reduction, a person's life measured by a single absence and declared insufficient. The words landed like an accusation against a room that has always been willing to confuse convenience with capacity. If that was the firing, I said to Marcus that evening, then I will make sure that the people who get to make those calls are people who know what a missed field trip feels like. He did not laugh. He only nodded and began to draft the first letters to the donors we believed would honor the spirit, if not the theater, of the original agreements. He contacted partners who understood teacher labor and who were pragmatic about outcomes. He asked for meetings. People responded with curiosity first, and then with a little adrenaline when they realized that for once, their money could be directly traced to outcomes they cared about. It's surprising how many people want their philanthropy to mean more than their name on a wall. We were careful. Always. We did not set out to humiliate my father or to create a spectacle. Our work was about changing structures. But the moment you touch money and power, spectacle often follows. And in a small, weird way, we were both relieved and terrified by what would come next. A week into the outreach, Marcus turned to me and said something he rarely says. I think this might get loud. I understood that as a blessing and a warning. I also understood that the kind of change we were envisioning would not be measured simply by a press release. It would be measured by whether we could get classroom teachers an emergency fund when a furnace broke, whether we could offer scholarships for summer learning programs that parents couldn't otherwise afford, whether we could create a mental health grant line for educators who were burning out. In the weeks after the gala, while we were assembling advisors and drafting bylaws, the dynamics at home shifted. My father called more often, his voice more tentative. Once he left a long voicemail where he spoke about legacy and the responsibility of setting things right. He did not, in that message, offer to reverse the decision. He offered his reminiscences and a kind of nostalgic counsel that felt both soft and evasive. Patricia sent a polite note about how proud she'd been of the gala. Jessica sent a text with a string of applause emojis. These gestures were small devices to smooth things over without having to address the substance of what had happened. There were moments when I imagined reconciliation in the simplest terms. A table reset, a handshake, a family portrait that included me in the middle and everyone smiling. But family is its own small nation with rules you were born into and cannot always change. There is a dignity in setting boundaries that are not always honored by others. Meanwhile, in classrooms across the district, teachers started to notice a different conversation unfolding. In parent groups, in PTA chats, in late-night teacher threads, people began to talk about representation and about whether the places that set priorities for schools actually include people who teach. The conversation spread not because we shouted, but because the problem was real and practical, and people were hungry for an answer that respected their work. If you are watching this and you teach, you know that teaching is not a job you clock out of mentally at the end of the day. It is the thing you carry into dreams, the thing you wake up worrying about when there's a cold in the classroom and a worry about whether a child will have breakfast. If you are not a teacher, you can at least imagine the small cumulative losses that happen when people who know the ground floor of education are left out of the rooms where policy is made. We were preparing to announce a foundation that would not be performative. We were preparing to show, concretely, that different is not less than. We were preparing to reframe our family humiliation into a structural correction that would outlast any single roster or speech. And then, before we had made our move public, something shifted again, in a way that made everything we were building feel both fragile and possible. The first part of our plan had done what plans do. It read the room, found a hinge, and began to apply pressure where it would do the most good. We had not yet signed any public statement. We had not yet taken the microphone. But leverage was accumulating in the quiet, like snow on a roof. At a small meeting with one of Marcus's partners, the kind of meeting held with coffee and careful schedules, someone leaned back and said, "So if you withdraw funds from the Hamilton Fund's commitments, what would that actually trigger?" It was the question that terrifies the people who want changes to be cosmetic. It was also the question that would define the line between a symbolic act and a structural redistribution of power. I listened to Marcus answer, watched his jaw set, and felt, for the first time, the scale of what might be possible. That night I went to sleep with the words my students had written about kindness in my mind. I slept because I had to. I slept because the next morning there would be work, and because the people who depended on me deserve a teacher who is steady. I slept, too, because I was learning, quickly and sometimes painfully, the difference between being personally wounded and being strategically wounded in service of a broader, collective correction. There are many stories people will want to tell about that time. A vendetta, an act of revenge, a fairy tale reversal. The truth is both messier and more ordinary. It was a plan built by people who were tired of watching small injustices accumulate into structural harms. We wanted to create a fund that would be governed by people who set copy grades and handed back red pens and stayed late until the lights in the school had been turned off. 2 nights before the big announcement, we were still drafting language. Marcus paced in the kitchen like a man who was both happier and more anxious than I had ever seen him. He kept saying, "If they think this is about ego, they will miss that it's about outcomes." I found that line comforting and true. On the morning that marks the threshold, the moment where gossip can turn into a pivot, I walked into the living room to find him at his phone, thumb moving through an email with the composure of a person who had rehearsed the line 100 times. He looked up at me and said simply, "When this goes public, it will be messy. People will pick sides." I nodded and felt the old, small terror of being seen in an ugly light. Yet under it, there was a clearer feeling, the radical humility of deciding to push resources where the work actually happens. The kitchen clock seemed to tick slower. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn, the ordinary sound of a neighbor's Saturday. We were ready, in the sense that you are ready when you have done the work to be honest about what you set out to do. We were not ready in the sense that anyone is ever completely ready for the cascade that follows when money moves in a new direction. When Marcus closed his laptop, he did not say much. He folded his hands over the device like a person who is guarding it. I could see in his expression that something had shifted from private strategy to public possibility. And I could see, in the moment his thumb hovered over the send button, that the private work we'd been doing had become a public promise. Marcus's face was the same steady geometry it always is, small smile, quiet jaw, and in it was the kind of intent that made me trust him, even when my chest was still raw from the gala. He closed his laptop and stood up like someone who had decided a small private urgency would have to become bigger if it were ever going to matter. We announced it the way he always preferred, without theater at first, with calls to a select group of partners and a short, plain statement to the fund's major sponsors. There was no press release at dawn with dramatic music. There were phone calls and a line of emails that laid out one simple position. Tekadu, our corporate partner, would withdraw its pledged support from the Hamilton Fund's teacher-designated commitments unless those commitments were honored in spirit and in practice. Tekadu would instead anchor a new, teacher-led foundation designed to put funds directly into classrooms and to ensure governance included active educators. Marcus had drafted it so that it sounded more like a question of fidelity to terms and fidelity to teachers, than like a personal attack. At first, the response was cautious. Sponsors wanted to know what it would mean for their own priorities. Boards wanted to know if this would spiral into a headline. People who make decisions about philanthropy are used to hedging. They are also, surprisingly often, hungry for outcomes that reach past a name on a wall. The moment Marcus's note landed, however, the local feeds began to hum. Someone had already clipped the gala video, the place cards, the long head table, my small print guest, and threaded it to the message. The combination of a small public slight and a corporate withdrawal created a pattern our town is allergic to ignoring. When we made the public announcement, Marcus did it in his own voice, calm, precise, deliberate. He did not shout my hurt or throw my family's name into the press. He stated a decision and why it mattered. He referenced Section 7.3, the clause we'd found that tied certain sponsorships to teacher representation, and explained plainly that honoring the spirit of donor intent required more than symbolic gestures. He announced that Tekadu would redirect its pledged funds to seed the new Olivia Hamilton Foundation, that it would provide office space and administrative support for the first year, and that it would open its books to a governance model that put classroom teachers at the center of decision-making. Saying those words out loud in a press conference felt both terrifying and right. A sea of cameras looked like a blue, blinking ocean. The first question shouted from the back. "Did you buy the building?" was the one I had been waiting for, though I hadn't quite known how it would sound when it came. Marcus answered with the kind of modesty that is its own form of clarity. Tekadu had legally acquired the lease to the office space the Hamilton Fund had used, yes, but it was less about ownership than about purpose. The building was an asset that could be a home for teachers, not a monument to a family name. We had chosen to turn a symbol of legacy into a working space for educators, into classrooms of ideas rather than a shrine. The words "bought the building" made for a sharp headline. What we had actually done was purchase a lease on a downtown office block and dedicate it as a hub for teacher-led grant-making, workshops, emergency assistance, and a storefront where educators could get help with things like curriculum development and mental health resource navigation. The public reaction was immediate and combustible. Teachers texted screenshots of the press conference with hearts and expletives of joy. Parents wrote op-eds and sent emails to school boards. Local radio hosts called us and wanted to know whether the move was performative or durable. For every cynical piece someone wrote, a dozen people posted stories of a program that had died because the right person was never at the table. I watched my social threads fill with anecdotes of small, real losses: a broken heater in a classroom, a teacher who had driven kids to a library because the school bus delayed, a coach who'd paid for uniforms. The sum of those small things is an enormous accountability. There were costs. My father heard the announcement the way someone hears a line moved on the chessboard. His voicemail was long and oddly poetic. Recollections of the early days of the fund, stories about kids who had once won grants, an appeal to family that read as nostalgia more than contrition. He didn't offer to reverse the board appointment that had been announced at his gala. Instead, he offered memories and the hope that we might, someday, find a way to understand each other. I listened to the message twice. There was tenderness in his voice and a careful evasion at the same time. His language was about legacy rather than the specifics of the choice that had cut me. That is what a lot of these private apologies sound like: well-meaning history without immediate correction. Patricia's calls were shorter and precise in the way of people who have made a life of managing impressions. Jessica's messages were the social media brevity of an applause emoji and a short "congrats." The optics for my family were strange, a middle-of-the-road mix of sympathy and embarrassment depending on the dinner table. For a few days, the town did what towns do. It debated everything from philanthropy to family loyalty, and decided that some people were on Team Teacher and some were on Team Tradition. The press coverage did not become a courtroom. There were op-eds, yes, and a few pieces that sniffed for scandal. But the narrative that took hold among educators was very simple: money redirected, teachers empowered. That story has a different kind of stickiness than the kind that loves a scandal. People who actually live under the fluorescent buzz of their school libraries want practical solutions, not gossip. We set the foundation up the way we had planned: bylaws that prioritize teachers and governance, Grant categories built from the bottom up: emergency relief, classroom innovation, professional development scholarships, a mental health fund, and a small advisory council of active teachers from 4 districts. Marcus and his team insisted on transparent accounting. I insisted on a grant review process that prioritized teachers who were in classrooms and understood the logistical realities of school life. We started with seed funding, enough to get the office set up, an emergency fund, and a small pilot scholarship. It wasn't by any stretch a fortune. It was, instead, a focused piece of capital aimed at making sure that when a heating system breaks, or when a teacher needs to buy a specialized text for a struggling reader, money would not be the obstacle. When we opened the doors of the newly named Olivia Hamilton Foundation, on the ground floor of that reimagined building, there was a small ribbon cutting. It was less gala and more potluck. Teachers brought casseroles. A kindergarten teacher brought a helium balloon that read, in a child's handwriting, "You matter." We had a small ceremony in which people from the neighborhoods we served spoke. The first grant we announced was an emergency furnace grant for a school in the next district, whose boiler had failed midwinter. The second was a set of micro-grants for classroom libraries. It felt like saying out loud that the money would go where the work is done, not to adorn anyone's portrait. For the Hamilton family, the move was disorienting. There was an immediate recalibration. Donors who'd previously written checks to the fund began to receive calls. Some asked questions about the terms on which they had made their gifts. Others wanted assurances that their names would appear on plaques. A few decided their philanthropic priorities lay elsewhere and shifted their commitments to the new foundation, citing the clear line between photographer-ready speeches and tangible outcomes. That decision-making process was messy and human, not a courtroom drama. There were donors who felt betrayed and donors who felt relieved. There were conversations where language like principles and stewardship came up, and not all of them landed gently. The viral moment arrived in a way that felt at first accidental. Someone, a teacher in a neighboring district, live-streamed the ribbon cutting from their phone. The looped video caught my speech in a few seconds. The bit where I said, "different isn't less than," and then paused because I felt ridiculous using a line that had started as a comment on a web thread. The clip got shared, and hashtags started to ripple. Different isn't less than. Teachers posted their own micro-videos saying what they needed: extra copies of standardized tests, substitutes when illnesses struck, money for classroom pets because those pets teach responsibility. Within a week, our inbox filled with requests. We were, in the most modern sense, a problem that people wanted to help solve. We did not respond by throwing grants at everything. Marcus and I had agreed from the start that scale without stewardship is a kind of cruelty. We built a small team of educators and program officers to triage requests, to make sure the funds reached classrooms with quick turnaround and discernment. A teacher in a district with fewer resources got an emergency grant within 48 hours for a car repair that enabled them to get to school. A third-grade team in another neighborhood received a microgrant to purchase leveled readers. We paid for a school counselor's weekend training so they could better handle the mental health crises that lined up at their office door. These are things that don't make front pages but change how a kid experiences a week of school. That was the measure of our work's success in the early days. Not how many headlines we made, but how many teachers called us crying in relief because they no longer had to pay for supplies from their own pocket. One teacher in the first year told me she'd spent her own stimulus check on binders and paper, and that our grant had allowed her to replace a piece of curriculum that finally reached a student who had been falling behind. She emailed me with a picture of the student smiling under a poster that read, "Readers are leaders." Those tiny human corrections are what made the foundation feel like a home rather than a brand. The Hamilton home life remained complicated. My father called on certain holidays and with circumscribed kindness. There were dinners where we spoke of weather, and there were moments where he asked about the foundation with a cautious pride that was mixed with embarrassment. Once, months after the gala, he handed me a small framed photo of me at graduation and said, "I was proud of you that day." The words were small and late, and I accepted them the way you accept a gift from someone who has not yet learned to give without strings. He never, in those conversations, asked to unseat Jessica publicly or to undo his decision. Instead, he offered supportive platitudes that asked me to be the clever, forgiving daughter I had been trained to be. I learned to accept those fragments of connection while also protecting my own peace. Patricia called a few times to say she hoped there were no hard feelings, which is a particular kind of soft apology. No sound, no particular promise. Jessica and I exchanged a few formal texts. There were moments where she seemed to want to be congenial. There were moments where she would go silent. The family never became a tidy arc toward unity. It became a small, constellated set of interactions in which I defined the distance I would allow. That, in itself, felt like an achievement. Some people wanted a revenge story and were unsatisfied with what they perceived as measured restraint. They wanted sparks. But my work, in the classroom and with the foundation, demanded a longer attention span than a single viral moment. The slow accretion of support felt better than a glare of vengeance. Besides, vindication tastes hollow when it is only about status. The kind that matters is the kind that leaves behind places that can survive you. We were careful to stay out of spectacles that glorified personal feuds. Instead, we sent out transparency reports. We published case studies about the grants we made, what worked, what didn't, and why. We invited teachers onto the Foundation's board, not to be tokens, but to be decision-makers. In our first year, we created a grant rubric co-written by active classroom teachers. We measured outcomes, how reading levels changed, how teacher retention improved in schools that received mental health support, how emergency relief prevented burnout. The numbers were modest at first, and the stories were big. Both mattered. Within 18 months, the Foundation had distributed emergency grants to over 400 classroom teachers, seeded 50 classroom innovation grants, and awarded 20 scholarships for advanced certification. We hired a small program manager who'd once worked nights shelving books at a public library and who understood how to help teachers write compelling grant narratives. We published those numbers because transparency breeds trust. People who give money to causes want to know their dollars did the thing they intended. The public fallout for my father and Patricia was mostly reputational, not the kind of legal consequences tabloids try to invent, but the slow realignment of donors and community relationships. That shift is a kind of social consequence, and in it there is both pain and learning. My father called one afternoon and read me a passage from a book about leadership that he thought might interest me. The call felt like an attempt at connection. Whether it would turn into something more substantive remained unclear. I kept boundaries where it mattered, family interactions limited, conversations about the Foundation public and formal. Boundaries are not a way to punish. They are a way to protect a life's work from being subsumed by unresolved family dynamics. The media moved on to other stories many times over. A few outlets wrote profiles about how technology companies and philanthropies navigate ethics. Others did critiques. There were op-eds that accused us of theatrical philanthropy, and op-eds that celebrated the way funds could be made to flow differently. In the quiet between coverage cycles, there was real work to do: grant processing, teacher outreach, board meetings, staff support. The Foundation's office filled with the sounds of people making small plans, phone calls, laughter over shared mistakes, the hum of copy machines. There were stacks of thank you cards from students who'd benefited from a reading program, and plates of food from teachers who treated the staff as if ours were a neighborhood kitchen. As the months unfolded, a small but steady change emerged in the community. Parent groups became more vocal about asking whether the people who set priorities for their schools had actually ever stood on the playground with a whistle. PTA meetings began to include more teachers as voices in decision-making. Teachers themselves, seeing what an organized group of educators could do when they had funding and voice, started to form peer networks that were not only about venting, but about policy proposals. That kind of civic engagement, the sort that moves from small complaints to organized actions, is slow and stubborn and rarely attractive to headlines. It is, however, the change that embeds new power. One day, standing in my classroom with a stack of spelling tests to grade, I felt a flutter in my abdomen that was not stress or excitement about a board meeting. It was different and softer, and, as it turned out, a small life beginning to announce itself. I told Marcus in the kitchen, over burnt toast and morning coffee, and he laughed in that half-suppressed way he does when he's glad without wanting to make a fuss. The news felt private and luminous. For the first time in a while, my sadness and my joy were not competing for the same space. They were layered. We began to plan small, practical things: a doctor's appointment, a conversation about how to balance teaching, and a new little life. Decisions about who would be at the birth. The pregnancy made the choices I'd been making, to stay in the classroom, to lead a foundation that served teachers, more vivid. I could imagine a child who would know teachers as a profession that mattered, not as an afterthought. I could imagine parents who treat educators as essential workers in the truest sense. That image grounded me more than any headline ever could. In the second year of the foundation, we launched a teacher mental health program in partnership with a local nonprofit mental health clinic. It offered sliding scale therapy sessions for educators and no questions asked emergency grants for teachers in personal crisis. The program's first year saved several teachers from leaving the profession when they might otherwise have had to choose between work and survival. Teachers wrote to me and said that having access to a therapist who understood the rhythms of the school year was like having someone in the room with them who could help repair the edges. These are the unglamorous victories that nonetheless matter more than any banquet. We also started a small fellowship for early career teachers who wanted to pilot literacy interventions. Fellows received a modest stipend, a coach, and a community of peers, and they brought into classrooms new techniques that were rooted in local needs. When one fellow's pilot raised third-grade reading levels by measurable steps, the district invited the model to scale. It was a quiet domino. A local teacher learns something, tries it, proves it, and then the system listens. People sometimes ask whether being a classroom teacher and heading a foundation is sustainable. The truth is that it is messy and often exhausting. I teach half-days now. I chair half-day meetings. I have a program director who runs the daily work, and I still grade papers on evenings when the house is quiet. My students see me checking emails at recess sometimes, and they also see me modeling boundary setting and the idea that work can be both civic and tender. What I want them to see is someone who refuses to let humiliation make her small, who instead builds a space where other small, daily acts of care are honored. There are moments of grace, too. One afternoon, a parent came into my classroom with a wrapped book and a note that said, simply, "For Mrs. Hamilton, because you make my girl love school." Those small, undramatic tokens are the ones that sustain a teacher. The foundation allows more of those small gifts to happen across classrooms. A year after the public announcement, at a meeting where the board evaluated the foundation's first-year outcomes, we read aloud letters from teachers who had used emergency funds to stay in their classrooms. There were sobs in the room. The metrics, retention rates, reading level improvements, scholarship completions, were important, but the letters were the moral ledger. We voted to expand the emergency fund and to pilot a district partnership that would underwrite substitute teachers so that when a teacher needed to take medical leave, their class would still get continuity. As for my father, there were afternoons we spent in practical conversation rather than theater. He helped with a fundraising event, awkwardly and with a speech that was, at first, careful, and then later, with a quieter presence. He never said the words that would make the gala undone. He never offered to publicly acknowledge the wrong in a way that would make him more uncomfortable than he could tolerate. But he supported a small literacy program with a check that did not litigate our past. It was a modest, imperfect reconciliation, not full absolution, but movement. Sometimes people ask whether I felt vindicated. I answer that there is a difference between vindication and accountability. Vindication tastes like personal triumph. Accountability tastes like correction that prevents harm to others. I prefer the latter. Turning my humiliation into a structural fix for teachers who needed help felt like a way to honor what I had always known. That dignity belongs to everyday laborers, to people who show up in the rain and read aloud and hand out glue sticks with an economy of love. On the day my son, a small, impatient, loud, and marvelous human who arrived on a humid July afternoon, took his first stroller ride past the foundation's office, a teacher from down the block waved and called his name. The small domestic miracle of that moment, a teacher celebrating a teacher's child, felt like the closure I needed. Not a big reconciliation with every person who'd failed me, but a confirmation that the work continued and that people who care about kids were at the center of it. Years later, the foundation had standing programs that other districts wanted to replicate. We advised other philanthropies about the ethics of teacher-centered giving. My father sat on a small advisory panel once but never regained the authority he once had. That's okay. Leadership changes. Institutions evolve. A legacy that preserves power for the sake of having it is not the same thing as a legacy that preserves care. I tell you all of this because the headline that brought you here is designed to be dramatic. They fired me for taking a day off, so I bought the entire building. It reads as a tidy arc: insult, reversal, conquest. The truth is less cinematic and I think more useful. I was made invisible in a room where my presence mattered. That invisibility was a kind of firing, social and practical. What we did was not a tidy revenge. It was a reallocation of attention and resources. We converted humiliation into accountability and into a structure that helps teachers do the work they are called to do day after day. If you are someone who has felt erased, whether at a workplace or at a family table, know that public humiliation does not have to become the final edit of your life. Sometimes it can be the hinge for something larger, if you have allies and if you are willing to do the slow work of building. And if you are a person with resources, financial or relational, know that the most radical thing you can do in philanthropy is to listen to the people doing the work and to fund them directly. I remain a teacher. I still keep the jar of mismatched crayons, and the shoebox of thank you notes is now twice as thick. I teach with the humility of someone who knows the stakes. A single lesson can change a child's week. A single counselor can keep a teacher from leaving. I also remain the chair of a foundation whose work is to make sure that when something breaks, a teacher does not have to choose between work and family in the way I once did. To every teacher watching, you are not just anything. Different isn't less than. To anyone who has ever felt smaller than they are supposed to feel, let this be both a story and an offer. Dignity can be reclaimed through community, through organization, and by redirecting resources where they do the most good. If this story moved you, please subscribe so we can keep sharing the work teachers do and the ways communities can support them. If you want to learn more about the foundation or join our mailing list to hear how to help teachers directly, you can find the Olivia Hamilton Foundation in the description below. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being overlooked is not the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning.